Thank you for joining us today. In this session, we will be discussing the basics of dust collection design for the pharmaceutical industry. My name is Chris Perrotte. I'm the industry segment leader at Donaldson and spent over 30 years helping companies improve industrial filtration systems, including in the pharmaceutical industry. We also have Amy Miller with us today, who is our training manager. She's working behind the scenes and will be moderating the question and answer sessions at the end.
Thanks for all of you for joining us today. Please go ahead and submit questions into the chat box as you think of them throughout the webinar, and Chris and Neil will answer them towards the end of the session.
Okay, we're going to start off today's webinar by reviewing some common pharmaceutical processes that typically utilize dust collection. Then we will get into the four primary components for a pharmaceutical dust collection system design: hoods, ducts, collectors, and fans. And we will finish up with everyone's favorite, the question and answer session. In case you aren't familiar with Donaldson Company, we have been solving customers' complex filtration challenges for over 100 years. We were founded in 1915 by Frank Donaldson Sr., who invented the world's first tractor engine air filter. Today, we are one of the largest providers of unique filtration technologies, and we excel at producing high-quality filters and equipment. We pride ourselves on having a global reach with a local touch. Our world headquarters is in Bloomington, Minnesota. We have 54 manufacturing plants and 23 distribution centers around the world. Before I introduce our featured speaker, I wanted to quickly explain how to engage with us. As you think of questions throughout the webinar, please type them into the chat box and Neil will answer them towards the end of our session. Neil will also ask you a few questions during the webinar, and you can respond with a reaction emoji. You can access these by clicking on the face icon at the bottom of the screen. I'm pleased to introduce our featured speaker today, Neil Young. Neil is a senior territory manager for Donaldson Company out of Kansas City. His territory includes Nebraska, Kansas, Western Iowa, and Western Missouri. He has over 14 years of experience in the air quality control field. Prior to joining Donaldson, Neil spent 10 years with a large industrial air filtration company working across all industries. Neil holds a bachelor's degree from Northwest Missouri State University, and he is also a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt certified. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Neil.
All right, thank you, Chris. I'd like to start out by asking if everyone could just share their level of experience with designing dust collection systems specific to the pharmaceutical industry. So if you don't mind, please select the reaction emoji that best aligns with your experience level.
Okay, looks like we've got a lot of people's experience today, so that's good to know.
Thank you. That is helpful for us to know the experience level of the group. So as we get started. All right, so let's talk a bit about the dust generated during the pharmaceutical applications. There are a lot of important reasons that we control the dust, such as improving the air quality for workers, and especially those operating in areas where they're at risk of exposure. It's critical that we reduce any potential for dust in their breathing zones. There are environmental concerns. EPA standards for outdoor exhausted air quality and outlet emissions must be met. Safety concerns and hazards. A lot of pharmaceutical dust is combustible. So NFPA has guidelines for fire and explosion mitigation that must be considered. Pharmaceutical manufacturing typically follows CGMP, which is current good manufacturing processes that must be met. And there are standards that are required by the FDA and other governing bodies. And lastly, cleanliness. A clean facility is going to have less issues, less maintenance requirements, higher equipment reliability, increased production, and most importantly, a safer work environment. Okay, so pharmaceutical manufacturing is a diverse and evolving industry that develops and manufactures consumable products for health and nutritional purposes. Products in this industry generally fall into two categories. You have finished goods and specialty chemicals. So finished goods, we're talking about prescription medications, over-the-counter medications, vitamins, supplements, cosmetics, personal care items, things of that nature. When we talk about specialty chemicals, those are products that consist of either an excipient, which is just a fancy way of saying an inactive ingredient, things like flavors, colors, and binders, or biological compounds known as active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs. So within pharmaceutical manufacturing, there are multiple processes where manufacturers need to control the dust. And it starts at the receipt of materials where non-medication ingredients generally arrive in bulk bags and go through a crushing and milling process before being weighed. Then they're mixed in an industrial mixer. And finally, they go through a granulation process where often the product undergoes a high pressure compaction prior to being dried. And throughout each of these processes, it's important to capture the dust that is generated. And then the other main area where dust is generated is during product formulation. So after the granules have been formed, powders are weighed and packaged. Pills, on the other hand, are tableted, coated, which makes them easier to swallow, and then packaged. Manufacturers may also produce capsules, and sometimes these are filled with liquid, but they're also commonly filled with a dry formula, which can also be an area where dust is generated. Okay, here's an image of what a typical pharmaceutical process might look like. As you can see, there are many steps throughout the process that will require dust collection. Well, let's talk about the common characteristics of pharmaceutical dust. Typically, it is small and uniform in size, lightweight, hygroscopic, meaning that it attracts moisture. So any wet applications or introduction of moisture to a process could cause a particulate to become sticky, and then it dries in a hard crust that can be difficult to manage from a filtration standpoint. It can blind off filters and create issues. Agglomerative dust is a dust that tends to stick together, either as a nuisance dust or part of a process. Dust that's introduced to moisture or solvents commonly will attract or bind to other small particles, which creates large clumps. It can create filtration issues unless planned for in advance. Prolonged exposure to many varieties of pharmaceutical dust can definitely be hazardous to workers' health and environmental health, and it's typically combustible. So, as I said, pharmaceutical dust is commonly combustible, meaning there's a risk of a fire, flash fire, or an explosion. If the dust or fume is combustible, it mixes with air, like the airflow coming into a dust collector, and an ignition source, it could result in a fire. That's what you see on the fire triangle there on the left side. Now, if you add in the dispersion of dust, which is very common in pulse jet cleaning dust collectors, you have the potential for a flash fire. That's that middle section. And finally, if you add in the confinement of dust with all these other characteristics, you are at risk for potential explosion. This is a complex issue. We hold separate training sessions dedicated specifically to combustible dust. I'll circle back briefly towards the end of this session, but for now, just know if the dust is combustible, there needs to be a mitigation plan in place to protect workers and property. Okay, let's get into all the basics of dust collection system for pharmaceutical manufacturing. Here we have a diagram of how a typical source collection dust system works. You've got a blower or fan that creates an airflow, and that airflow is used to capture dirty air within a hood and then convey the material through a series of ducts to a dust collector. Here, the contaminant is separated out and clean air passes through the filter media to the fan, where it is typically discharged to atmosphere. One thing to note, for many pharmaceutical applications, outdoor venting isn't allowed. So it's very common to have a HEPA rated after filter on the return air side of the system, just to capture any fines that may make their way through the dust collector. Within these systems, each and every component is selected and sized based on the characteristics of the dust and resulting in a required airflow. and other various factors within the applications themselves. So if one component is poorly designed, it can impact the entire system. When we design a system, there are a lot of factors that we consider. You can see a lot of them listed here, such as material that's being collected, what's the static pressure, are there any plans for future expansion? Probably a lot more goes into it than most people realize. And the publication that you see here on this slide is the Industrial Ventilation Guide. It's written by the ACGIH, which is a nonprofit scientific organization that advances occupational and environmental health. The guidelines in it are considered by most in the industry, including OSHA, as the standard for proper ventilation and design. The ACGIH offers multiple courses throughout the year on system design using the Vent Guide as a textbook. I've attended multiple courses over the years myself, and if it's something that you look to get into more on dust systems design, I'd highly recommend that you check it out. Okay, so we'll get into some of the formulas. There are a lot of different formulas that are used when we design a system. The most basic and widely applied being airflow. What's the airflow requirement? The formula for that is Q equals V times A. So in that formula, the Q is the volume of air that's moving through the system, oftenly referred to as a CFM because it's measured in cubic feet per minute. And to get the airflow, we multiply the velocity of the air, which is the measure of linear speed for an object, by the area of the hood or duct that the air is flowing through. This formula is one of the basic building blocks of dust collection system design. We start with the pickup points and calculate using this formula to get the needed airflow of each pickup, and this will give us a total CFM needed for the system. This formula is also used when calculating the needed velocity within the ductwork. Throughout the design of a system, we refer to Q equals V times A over and over. All right, a few more basic terms to review quickly for those of you who are new to dust collection. We'll talk about a few different types of velocities in this presentation, such as duct velocity or conveying velocity, which is the speed of air flowing through the duct. Capture velocity is the speed of air at the hood, and it's measured in feet per minute. Another type of velocity is the air to media ratio, or AMR. And this is the velocity of the airstream as it enters and passes through your filter media. Sometimes it's referred to as filtration velocity, air to cloth ratio. It's calculated by taking the actual CFM and dividing that by the total filter area. It's expressed as a ratio such as 6:1. So in that example, it would be 6 cubic feet of airflow for every 1 foot of filter media. And the last basic term I want to talk about is static pressure. Static pressure is just resistance to airflow in a system, and it's common from things like the dust collector, the filters inside the collector, which create more resistance as they get dirty, the hoods, the ductwork. Static pressure is a critical factor to take into consideration when we're designing a system. Okay, so the first component we'll talk about is the hood. It's a critical component for system design that allows for contaminant and collection of fugitive dust. You know, a well-designed hood should pull the particulate away from the operator's breathing zone, kind of like you see here. Got the little guy there by number 1. The dust is being pulled away from the breathing zone and into the ductwork through the dust collector. Now we can back up 1 second on that. An example of an ineffective would be, let's say that same worker needs to work under the second section. That's not a good application for that hood design because that dust is being pulled up directly through his breathing zone. Okay. So a well-designed hood is going to minimize the amount of airflow that's required to effectively capture and control the dust where it's released. And you'll hear that commonly, minimizing the airflow, and that's all because of airflow equals cost. So if we can do an effective system at the lowest airflow, it's going to be cost effective both upfront and over the life of the collector. It should be designed with good ergonomic principles. It should be compatible with the material flowing through the work area, and it should be designed to minimize the maintenance and other activities that may disrupt your process. When it comes to assessing an existing system, some common mistakes that we see is the wrong style of hood being used, the hood's not located in an effective position, or you have inadequate airflow at the hood. So here are some common types of hood. A closed capture hood is generally the most effective method of capturing material. And these, as you can see, are in order of increasing effectiveness, but also increasing fabrication costs. So you start out with a raw edge hood, which really isn't much of a hood at all. It's just going to pull air from wherever it can. A little better option would be the flanged hood because it's directing the air on one side of that flange. As you get further down the list there, they're a little bit more specialized and more effective. All right. So in pharmaceutical applications, it's much more common to see things like what you see here in this image, where we're tying our ductwork into a piece of equipment that has an existing hood built into it. It's important that those hoods are positioned properly relative to where the contaminant is emitted to be most effective. And we want to minimize the air volume. The hood should be close to the capture point, but we don't want it so close that it's disrupting the process or pulling good material. By the same token, you don't want it too far away either, because that can impact cost because you need more airflow, more fan energy to make that happen. And as I said earlier, it's pretty common to see the equipment from an OEM that has a port where we tie directly into that equipment as opposed to a separate freestanding hood. All right, when we determine the required airflow at the hood, the main design factor is called capture velocity. And this is the velocity required at the point where the dust is generated to get control of that dust and direct it into the hood. For pharmaceutical manufacturing, capture velocity is typically about 50 to 250 feet per minute, although it will depend on the application and the style of the hood being used. When we design hoods, we want to avoid extremes on the airflow. Too much airflow at the hood or pickup point may mean you're picking up good product rather than just nuisance dust. And since more energy is required to move more airflow, this could lead to higher than expected operational cost. Insufficient airflow at the hood could require additional housekeeping measures to be implemented. And depending on the dust, it may lead to an increased risk of exposure with these potentially harmful dusts.
I'm going to interrupt you for a moment. Neil, you probably need a drink of water about now anyway. So just a quick reminder to everybody out there to chat in any questions as you think of them, and we'll address them during the question and answer session at the end.
Thanks, Chris. So once we design the proper hood to capture the dust, the goal is to move that particulate to the filtration system through a series of ducts. So a properly designed duct system should do a few things. It should pull the minimum airflow required at each hood, maintain the velocities required to transport the material through the duct and to the dust collector. And you must be able to do this utilizing, as I said earlier, the least amount of energy possible and minimizing any wear and tear on the duct components. Few common mistakes that we see when it comes to duct design: the incorrect type of ducting is being used, incorrect duct sizing or a fitting is being used, and most commonly is probably the duct system is not balanced correctly. So when it comes to duct, minimum duct velocity is a critical design factor. If you drop below that, the dust can settle out within those ducts, become heavy, cause safety issues, not to mention that you lose airflow. In pharmaceutical manufacturing, minimum conveying velocities, and that is the velocity that's required to move that dust from the hood to the dust collector, typically are going to fall in the 3,000 to 4,500 feet per minute range. But with combustible dust, 4,000 feet per minute is the minimum duct velocity. So that's where we typically will set our duct velocities between 4,000 and 4,500 feet per minute. If your duct velocity is too high, it can require more energy to move that air through the duct. more cost. Ultimately, this can impact the size of the system fan and create issues such as increased noise, abrasion, or wear and tear. Okay, so next I'm going to show you a few different images, and I'd like to see if you could give me a thumbs up or if you think it's a good idea, or a thumbs down if you think it's a bad idea for use in pharmaceutical manufacturing systems. If you're not sure, just take a guess. You got a 50-50 shot. All right, here's the first one. So in this image, we've got rectangular duct on the dirty air side. You give us a thumbs up if you think this is a good idea, or a thumbs down if you think it's a bad idea for dust collection systems.
Yeah, as a reminder for everyone who's not hitting anything right now, you can find the thumbs up, thumbs down icons by clicking on the little smiley face.
I don't
Okay.
think I've seen a single thumbs up yet, Chris.
No, nobody, we have no friends of HVAC ductwork here today.
Well, we got a bunch of experts. Everyone's correct. Rectangular duct is commonly used in HVAC applications where you're just moving air. It really doesn't have a place in industrial systems. When using rectangular ducting, the velocity at the edges and corners of that duct are so low that you're going to have material settle out. Not only does this require more energy, more costs, but the additional weight of that dust could exceed the duct support system and leave a huge mess for everyone to clean up. We only want to use round duct on the dirty air side. On the clean air side, returning air to a space though, no issues with rectangular duct. All right, on to the next one for consideration. So here we're using class 3 ductwork. Would you say this is good or bad for dust collection systems?
Looks like the consensus is most people think it's good, Neil.
Most of you got it again. Very good. Most dust collection applications will use class 2, 3, and 4 ductwork, which are designed to SMACNA standards, and that's the Sheet Metal and Air Conditioning Contractors National Association. The higher the class rating of the ductwork, the heavier the gauge. Class 2 is typically used for very fine, light, dry dust and low concentrations, things like cotton, lint, or wood, maybe flour. Class 3 is most frequently used for industrial dust in low to moderate concentrations, or very fine, light, dry dust in high concentrations. So think granite dust or material handling would be good examples. And lastly, class 4 is extra heavy duty for heavy, moist, sticky dust in moderate to high concentrations, things like cement dust or lead dust. All right, on to the next one here. Spiral ducting, good or bad for dust collection systems?
It looks like we got a few mixed results. There was a little bit of a delay in answering that one, so a little bit more of some question here, I think.
No, it actually is very common to be a hot topic here, whether it's good or bad. Spiral duct is less expensive, and although I've seen it used effectively, it can leak air and could impact your design airflow by as much as 10%. So if you do specify spiral ducting, make sure that it's heavy gauge, typically 16 gauge for pharmaceutical dust, and smooth on the inside. If you're using spiral duct outside, it can create a prime source for water to enter the ductwork and get into the dust collection system. So I always say use spiral duct with caution. Personally, I hesitate to use it outdoors. All right, how about flexible ductwork? Is that good or bad?
Mostly say bad, a few people say good.
Yeah, it's popular because it allows the operator to modify the hood location to fit their process, but that comes at a price. Because there isn't a smooth inner surface on flexible ducting, the air moves through and it faces resistance, which increases the static pressure and requires significantly more energy than traditional hard ducting. So if you're specifying flex ducting, we always recommend minimizing it as much as possible. if you just look at this photo on the left here, it's it's a common thing to walk into a facility and see actual machines connected with duct just like that laying on the floor. And you can see there's multiple curves there, a lot more duct work than is needed. So you want to create a situation where if you're installing flexible duct work, you try to take out as many of those bends as possible and limit the amount of footage that you're using. All right, so here's the last one. Here you've got a duct system with branch entries with T's and hard 90 degrees. Is this good or bad for a dust collection system?
Looks like the consensus is they say bad.
Yeah, good job. That's correct. Um, yeah, so if your elbows are mitered at 90-degree turns, we say the air has to slow down, but I'll kind of change that. Air is pretty dumb. It doesn't know to slow down. So instead, what it does is just goes full speed, slams into the backside at the turn, creates turbulence before it figures out it's got to go the other way. All that turbulence adds static to the system, creates issues with your conveying velocity, creates abrasion concerns. A much better way to go about that is, as you can see on the preferred there, where you've got a 2 to 2.5 times the diameter centerline radius. Many cases, we're acceptable with a 1.5 centerline radius for design reasons. And then on the branch entries, I always think about this in terms of the highway. If you're getting on the interstate and you have to come to a complete stop to make a hard right turn before you merge with traffic, I can only imagine what kind of news nightmare that would be. So as you can see, we want to design our ductwork similar to the highway on-ramps, 30-degree angle where the air comes in and just joins the existing airflow moving through the collection system. All right, so let's talk a little bit about balanced design. Having a balanced system is one of the most important aspects to effective dust collection systems. It makes sure that you're pulling the required amount of air from each hood. And to accomplish this, the energy needs for each leg of the system at a junction must be the same. So it's pretty common that we see customers have added new drops to an existing system without considering the impact it has on existing equipment. And if you remember way back in the beginning, when we showed the overall system, I said that they're designed. If one part or one component is poorly designed, it affects everything. That's the most common thing we see is somebody adds a leg after the fact without knowing that the system wasn't designed to handle another leg. In most cases, the existing systems aren't modified to accommodate the additional airflow or static, and that causes the system to become unbalanced. On the other hand, if you know a customer is going to be expanding their process, there are ways that you can design future lines into a system so they don't have to sacrifice performance. But if a customer needs to add a line to existing system, call in a professional to help. Don't just do it and expect the system to work. All right, our next component is the dust collector. The main objective of the dust collector is to deliver the required efficiency, filtration efficiency, while operating in a predictable, stable, and economic fashion. Most common things that we see that go wrong with dust collection when it comes to design are the wrong filtration technology is used. It's not sized correctly, so it's either too aggressive or too conservative. Poor material handling. We always try to remind customers that the hopper is not for storing material. We want that dust to flow out of the collector onto the next step in the process. And lastly, poor installation. If the inlet orientation or the outlet of the fans are not properly designed, it can cause issues with how the dust is distributed within the collector. When it comes to pharmaceutical applications, cartridge collectors are most frequently used. However, if you're using or if the dust is moist or sticky, as we said earlier, most of it can be hygroscopic. A specific type of bag house that uses wider envelope-shaped filters is the best option. And since cartridge collectors are the most common, let's start there. They're typically smaller and have a lower initial cost than a bag house, and they're best when you're dealing with low to medium dust loads and dust that is fine, uniform, and dry, like those often found in pharmaceutical manufacturing. They're continuous duty. So what that means is they don't need to be shut down in order to clean the filters, and they clean with plant compressed air. They use smaller, easier to handle cartridge style filters. Changeouts are much faster with a cartridge collector versus a bag house. All right, so time for a little history lesson on cartridge collectors. Starting on the left there, way back in the 70s, we basically took a bag house and replaced the bags with cartridges as a way to reduce the footprint, um, give the customers more space in their plants. And it worked okay, but what we ran into is, like I said earlier, air is pretty dumb. So what happened was with that low inlet, it would slam off the back wall, work its way up and create some abrasion issues on that last row of filters. And then additionally, you have issues with what's called can velocity. So that upward air between the filters didn't really let those fine dusts work their way out of the system. As you pulse, that upward air was keeping that dust entrained on the filters. So next we move the inlet a little bit to allow gravity to assist us to bring the dust into the containers or the cabinets. And that worked a little bit better, but it created a different set of abrasions. So we had abrasion on the left side there. Still had some can velocity concerns, but it did reduce that as well. I should point out that there are still some dust collector manufacturers that use this style of cartridge where the filters are vertical like a bag house. And we actually have a few specialized cartridge collectors of our own that are vertical filters, but they're used for very specific situations, which I'll show you an example in a few moments. Majority of our dust collectors have been horizontal since the early 80s. And the reason for that is the downflow, using gravity to help us move that dust through the filters. And through airflow testing, it's actually in the vent guide that we showed earlier, US EPA sponsored research has shown superior performance results from that downward air in the dirty air stream. So the first iteration, the dirty air came in right over the top of the filters. Clean air goes out the clean air side. About a little over 10 years ago, we took that design and improved on it even more by introducing the venturis that you see on the right side there and moving the inlet over those venturis. So now heavier dust falls directly to the hopper and doesn't even get entrained on the filters. What that did for us is it extended the filter life considerably for our customers, as well as allowed us to be a little bit more aggressive on air to media ratios because those filters were lasting so long and it was a smaller footprint. So overall, it's been a great modification for us. Okay. So here are a couple examples of a DFE cartridge. The one on the left is a pharmaceutical facility where the collector's outside. You can see, point out a few different things on here. You've got the quiet cover over the fan housing as well as a silencer. So this is probably in an area where they're being good neighbors here and trying to keep the noise levels down. Also have an airlock on the discharge of the collector there. On the right, this is a DFE at a nutraceutical facility. And as you can see, this one's inside, and we're dealing with combustible dust. So those red scoops that you see on the roof of that DFE are actually flameless vents. And then the little red box that you got on the left side of the picture is an inlet isolation valve. So if a deflagration occurred inside this collector, those flameless vents are designed to be the weak point. So the pressure release is there, the flames are contained within the flameless vents, and when that occurs, that isolation flap valve on the left side slams shut so that any smoke, fire, anything like that doesn't make its way back into the process. The other thing I'll note on this one is you do see some spiral duct there, right? But it's on the return air side. All right, and then sometimes the airflow is small enough that we can use a packaged dust collector, such as the DF Pre that you see here. It's a really nice option because everything you need is pre-packaged, including the fan controls, makes installation much faster and easier. So a situation where you might use these, I'll just give you an example. We talked about AMR earlier, right? The DF Pre 2 that you see on the right there has up to 508 square feet of filter media. So if we're designing to a 3-to-1 AMR, we can use this in applications that are somewhere around 1500 CFM, depending on what the static pressure is. Okay, so earlier I mentioned there are specific situations where we may select a vertically hung cartridge filter. Here's the example where that makes sense. In this case, we're dealing with an extremely high static pressure situation, so it's over 20 inches of water column. This is our TD collector. As I said, it's got vertically hung filters. Just like the DFE, it's best for low to medium dust loads and fine uniform dry dust types. As you can see, this one is a higher pressure. We've got a pressure blower on there. It has a tangential inlet so that when the dust comes in, you get that cyclone effect for the heavier stuff to drop out. You can see it's got an explosion vent on the outside as well. Okay, cartridge collectors like the DFE and the TD, they all use cartridge filters. They come in many different shapes, sizes, and filtration medias depending on what the application requirements are or the customer needs. This pleated technology allows for a lot of filter media area in a relatively small filter space. And so when we're using a cartridge collector, I typically recommend a fine fiber media, and that's because it significantly outperforms the cellulose media or paper media that you see on the left. So for example, the red dots on the images are representative of a single dust particle. And as you can see, the cellulose media on the left has many more areas where there's big voids, which allow that particulate to embed itself in the media. So both larger and smaller particles can get deeper in the media, which is called depth loading, and it's not a good situation. Those filters will blind off and need to be changed out more frequently. But if you look at the fine fiber media, the dust cannot easily get beyond the surface of that fine fiber in the image in the middle. This allows for surface loading of the filter, which improves filtration, improves cleaning efficiency, and results in longer filter life. So this is a fun little simulation. We can get it to play here. There we go. Kind of shows what I mean. You can see that around here we like to say dust filters dust, right? You do want some of that dust on the surface of the filter because the varying particles help improve efficiency. You can see that some of the finer particles get through, but the larger particles, once they're on the filter, prevent that. And as we pull soft, the dust cake gets rearranged and dust falls into the hopper. All right. So the most common filter that I recommend in pharmaceuticals is Donaldson's UltraWeb Spun Bond. It's a MERV 15 cartridge media, and it filters down to a 0.3 micron particle size. We touched on it earlier, but when the dust collector is located indoors or we're returning air to a facility, always recommend a HEPA after filter, which are typically 99.97% efficient or greater. Okay, I mentioned that there are pharmaceutical dusts that can be hygroscopic. They attract moisture, and that sticky, moist dust can be very challenging because it cakes on the filters and it dries, and then they become less breathable, right? In these types of situations, we look to more of a specialty style baghouse collector. What we've got shown here is our Dolomatic G2, and it uses an envelope style bag, which you can see the animation on the left-hand side. There is an example of what that happens during cleaning of that filter bag. It looks like a pillowcase, and when it's blown air into it, it expands greatly. And as that air disperses and it gets snapped back onto the cage, it creates kind of a violent reaction that really does a good job of dislodging that material from the filter. This is used very successfully in difficult applications where you're dealing with extremely sticky or hard to handle dust. There are a few different types of medias that work well in the Dolomatic with these challenging situations. Most commonly in pharmaceutical is going to be a Tetra Tech on polyester. So Tetra Tech is a PTFE membrane that's bonded to a 16-ounce polyester. And this helps deliver superior dust cake release and high filtration efficiency. All right, this is just an example of a recent Dolomatic install that was done. You can see like the DFE I showed earlier, it's got a flameless vent on it. That's because it's inside. So the flameless vent was required by the AHJ. You can see that the return air, however, is going through the top of the roof there and being discharged outside the building. And then over here on the left, you can see the control panel is relatively close to the collector, which is fairly common in most cases. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about containment. When dealing with a hazardous material that can't touch the skin, another really important design consideration is containment. So this is a few examples of how we can minimize worker exposure to this hazardous dust. And the first photo there, photo 1, is a HEPA after filter housing. As mentioned previously, if fines get through the filter media or a hole or a filter's installed improperly, this is kind of the belts and suspenders method to make sure that that dust is still contained. You can see on that housing, there's a magnehelic gauge that reads the differential pressure across those filters. That's going to tell you when those filters get dirty. They don't have a way to be cleaned on a HEPA filter. That's more like the furnace filter in your house. So as they load up or as they become dirty, they would need to be replaced. The second photo is showing an underhopper locking cage. The pharmaceutical dust does have a street value, so there is a potential for theft in that situation, and this is just a way to mitigate that and prevent that theft. And then probably what I would call one of the most important is photo 3, and this is our bag in, bag out design configuration, which allows you to go in and change the dirty filters without ever coming in contact with the dust. So you have the plastic, you're working everything through that plastic, and you can actually pull the filter right into it, tie it off and wrap it up, and greatly reduce your exposure when doing dirty filter changeouts. Okay, so we've reached the final step in designing a system. We looked at all the calculations on the hood, the ducting, the dust collector. Now it's time to take all of that information and size the fan. The fan's got 2 responsibilities. First, it must deliver the necessary airflow at the required static pressure to maintain the conveying velocities within that ductwork over a range of static pressures. And it's a range of static pressures because those filters load up and become dirty and have more resistance, and then they clean and they have less resistance. Secondly, the fan you select should be able to deliver the desired static and airflow with an appropriate energy efficiency at an acceptable sound level. Fan challenges generally fall into 2 categories: poor fan selection and poor fan installation. So the 2 main system design factors for fans are static pressure and airflow. So this is an example from a system we designed, which had a required airflow of 9,000 CFM. We looked at the static resistance on the hoods that totaled 1.5 inches. The ductwork, including straight runs of duct, the elbows, branch entries, totaled another 2.5 inches of resistance. We always designed for 6 inches of resistance with dirty filters. And then the filter, the fan ducting, created another inch of static. So the total system static pressure was at 11 inches of water gauge. And so to size the fans, we use fan curves. This is a simplified version for a small Donaldson backward inclined fan, but you should work with your fan manufacturer to make sure you're selecting and sizing the best fan for the system. So to continue with the example I just showed on the previous slide, we look at the system static pressure of 11 inches and line that up with the airflow of 9,000 CFM. We line those factors up and you can see the fan curves on the chart, which tell us the effective range of each fan size. So in this case, I selected the torque backward inclined, or TBI 30. One important note is when the filters are new, the process owner should damper back the fan unless they've got a VFD or a variable frequency drive to adjust the speed automatically. I wouldn't size down to a TBI 25 since it might not provide enough airflow as the filters get dirty. So to finish things up, and then we'll open it up for questions, there are a few other design considerations that we should talk about. The first one being total cost of ownership. When you're designing a system, it's important to understand, how much energy is required to operate it. Where's the unit coming from? Is it easy to get replacement parts? How long do the filters last? How easy is it to change filters or maintain the system? And what's the life expectancy? So now many dust collector manufacturers, including Donaldson, are offering the ability for operators to monitor their systems remotely. At Donaldson, we call this system our IQ, which essentially makes a dust collector what we call a smart collector. And this allows customers to be able to monitor their dust collectors remotely. It provides customers with real-time data alerts and alerts them when there's an issue. It also has the ability to provide historical reporting. So as you can imagine, customers find this incredibly beneficial. Again, most manufacturers are heading in this direction and customers are on board for it. And it's definitely something to consider when you're specifying a system. And everyone's favorite, the additional regulatory considerations. Each of these agencies may have design expectations to reduce process-related hazards. And as we all know, they aren't always consistent with one another. So knowing the hazards related to the process the system is designed to handle will enable you and the customer to make some critical design decisions upfront in the process. It can be extremely expensive and time consuming to change the design once the equipment is installed and operational. All right, I want to briefly circle back on the topic of combustible dust. So the National Fire Protection Agency, or NFPA, is a global self-funded nonprofit organization devoted to eliminating death, injury, property, and economic loss due to fire, electrical, and related hazards. The standards developed by the NFPA are called consensus standards because they're widely recognized by authorities. NFPA standards are referenced in national and international fire and mechanical codes, which are adopted by many states and municipalities. And if so, local building inspectors and fire marshals may be required to enforce NFPA standards. OSHA also considers NFPA standards to be good engineering practices. And during a general safety inspection, they may reference NFPA standards when issuing fines to a facility under the General Duties Clause. So on this slide, you can see some different mitigation options that process owners can consider. We touched on the flameless vents a little bit, the inlet isolation. Depending on the application and the authority holding jurisdiction and the process owner's risk tolerance, you may choose one or many different options that you see here. But I always say, give me a call and we can provide you with the expertise needed to make the best selections for each situation.
All right, great job, Neil. Chris, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Great job. Designing dust collection systems for pharmaceutical manufacturing can be complicated, and there's a lot that goes into it, but that's what we're here for. We sold countless dust collection systems around the world, and we have local support in your market, and we're here to help you make sure that you get it right the first time. So Interfex is a major annual New York City trade show for pharmaceutical and biotech professionals to explore cutting edge manufacturing technology and equipment. Give us a thumbs up if you're going to be attending Interfex next week. It looked like we had one or two. We'll have Ryan Harlow, our New York City territory manager, at the show. He's interested in pharmaceutical technology as New Jersey's a hub. So hope to see you all there, and give us an email if you'd like to have a chat while you're there with us. We're going to finish up with some question and answers. Neil and Amy, you can turn your cameras back on. Just a heads up that everyone who attended will receive an email that includes your professional development hour credit. If you don't get yours, please send us an email. There's a few QR codes if you're interested, including the events page for live upcoming webinars next month. We'll be focusing on mist collection for wet machining, and the on-demand page where we post recordings of past webinars. A recording of this webinar will be available on the site as soon as possible. We also offer a 5-hour in-person system design training for engineers. We have Midwest sessions coming up this spring. Chicago is on April 30th and Minneapolis in June. And Neil will be hosting a class in Kansas City this fall. Do email us if you'd like more information. Amy, what's our first question?
All right, so first question, Neil, does Donaldson provide hoods?
We do, yeah. We will work with you not only in designing the hood, but we work with different fabricators and can create, um, design and sell and install the hoods.
Thank you. Next question, do you typically require a particulate analysis to determine the recommended capture velocity and minimum duct velocity for a specific application?
That's a great question. To answer your question, if you have it, absolutely. If the customer is willing to go do that, it will help dial it in very well. But I will say at Donaldson, we have the luxury of having so many years of experience. So unless it's something that we haven't dealt with before, we've got a large application database where we can take a look at what the application is and most likely come up and help guide you on that.
Thank you, Neil. Next question, how would you balance a system without manual dampers?
Uh, VFD. So if we can install a VFD in the control panel, that will modulate that fan. We set it up when we do a startup of collector, dial in exactly what the duct velocity needs to be, and then set those parameters in the VFD, and it will maintain that duct velocity throughout the entire system.
Thank you. Next question, does Tort offer an FDA-approved cartridge filter for customers that need to recover and return the dust collected back to the process?
We do. Yeah, that's important to call out up front, because not every filter is FDA approved, but there are filters that come with that certificate that says they're approved for um, product contact.
All right, next question, is flexible ducting bad even if it's straight?
Sometimes it's unavoidable, right? I don't want to say it's bad because it gets a bad rap. Sometimes you have to use flexible ducting. I would just say if you can avoid it, then do so. If you have to have it for one reason or another, make it as straight as you possibly can and as short as you possibly can.
Yeah, minimize as much as possible, right?
Right, right.
So next question, is there a concern with incompatible dusts in the pharmaceutical industry? I had a customer for a vitamin encapsulation that had hundreds of different materials that did not have DHAs performed.
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely a concern there. Most customers, because of that CGMP processing, have guidelines in place that say, okay, if we're mixing products and there's potential for cross contamination, then we've got to do a complete wash down of the system before we run the next product, right? But absolutely, if you have two dusts that could create a reaction, that's where the DHA, they need to have the DHA perform. We are big fans of DHAs. We recommend every customer do a DHA. We've got some partners that we can recommend based on where they're located that will go out and perform that for them. Donaldson doesn't do DHAs ourselves, but having that DHA is your first line of defense, right? It's your playbook, if you will, on how you're going to handle dust and how you're going to put processes in place to keep everyone safe and avoid any kind of conflict.
Thank you. Yeah, if you have, if you're looking for a good non-biased, maybe I don't know how you say it, right? If you're looking for someone that can help with dust analysis, let us know. Just shoot us an email at training@donaldson.com and we'll give you a few recommendations that are good and non-biased. Okay, so Neil, next question. What would you consider to be low to medium dust loading?
That's a great question. It really comes down to the grain loading without getting too far into the weeds. You know, how how many grains per cubic foot is being put into the system? Uh, Kind of caught me off guard on giving you a number there for that. I have to go back and look it up, but I can get you some information on that and send it to you after the fact.
All right, thank you. How is the lifespan of sheet metal dust conveying duct determined? Let's see. I imagine it would eventually would wear out over time, and our access doors required.
So the I guess the question is sheet metal duct, I'm assuming, but it all
That's I
depends.
was trying to figure out. Okay,
Yeah,
that's probably what it
yeah, probably so. It really depends on the nature of the dust itself, right? Sometimes if we're dealing with dusts that are extremely abrasive, um, maybe very hard in terms of tensile and things like that, and you can help extend the lifespan of your duct system if it's properly designed, right? If you are conservative with those centerline radiuses that we talked about and design it 2.5 to 1 instead of 1.5 to 1, that's going to create a more gradual turn and less potential for turbulence. If you design a system with a bunch of mitered 90 degrees and T transitions, it's going to wear out faster because all of those points where you've got turbulence is also areas where you could have abrasion and have to wear those out. To the second part of the question, access doors required. I think access doors are a great idea, especially in flange duct. A lot of the duct that we sell specifically in uh, pharmaceutical is clamped together style ducts or easy duct, we call it. So it's rolled lip edges with a clamp, and it's got adjustable sleeves that can help make it fit in any scenario. But those come in 5-foot sections, and it's very easy to take the clamp off, pull down a 5-foot section, clean it out, put it back in place, and clamp it back together. So it really is one of those it depends answers. But if you've got long runs of duct that it's flanged without the ability to take it apart and clean it, access doors are great.
So next question, and I'm trying to remember when this one came up. This may have been that nutraceutical example. They're asking, don't you need an outlet isolation valve?
Depends on what your AHJ and your DHA say. The answer in most cases is yes. If you're dealing with combustible dust and you're returning that air to the building, typically you would have some sort of an abort gate on the return air side prior to the HEPA filter, so that if an explosion occurred, the inlet isolation slams shut, the explosion vent goes, and then the abort gate goes. So any smoke or debris is being routed outside as opposed to being blown back into the HEPA filter and into the building. But that's one of those questions where it really comes down to what does the DHA say? What does the authority holding jurisdiction say? You know, whether that's your insurance company, your fire marshal, the plant EHS, all of those things come into play there.
Thank you, Neil. Next question, how does that bag in, bag out bags let the door screw on to the threaded rod without, so the yoke, without
Yeah.
having a hole in the bag? So kind of how exactly does that work?
So you're basically opening the door with the knobs through the plastic, and it opens in, and then you're able to, with that plastic, pull the filter out, and there's a clamp that goes over the edge where it's kind of a cut. And I don't know, this may not be the most PC way to describe it, but if you've ever had kids and you had a diaper genie, it's very similar to the diaper genie, right? In terms of how that's cut off and then clamped so that it keeps everything contained.
That's a good comparison. All
Yeah.
right. So next question, should fans be backward inclined or radial blade for pharmaceutical?
It really depends on each application. There's good cases to be made for each, but we would look at the situation and choose based on the appropriate.
All right, so kind of a follow-up to bag in, bag out. With the use of bag in, bag out and continuous liners, can Donaldson certify an OEB level for the system?
I don't. That's a good question, and one that I may have to take offline. My gut reaction is that we probably aren't going to provide that because there's so many other variables that go into how a plant operates versus just what we provide. So in that situation, you know, we may provide something that limits all of the exposure, but that doesn't mean that it's being implemented the way it was designed. So
Okay.
there's some risk there, but let me take note of that one and
Yeah.
we'll follow up offline.
Yep, absolutely. We'll reach out to you on that one. And next one, we were told that DFO, so an older style, has a FDA filter which is no longer available. Can you clarify which collectors have an FDA approval?
That's another one we'll take offline. I'm the
Okay.
equipment guy, not the filter guy. So a lot of times what we're coming up with is specified on the front end. And I'll be honest with you, most of the pharmaceutical applications that we are working in are not product contact. It's nuisance dust where they're just trying to get that dust out of the system, get the airborne stuff so it's out of people's breathing zones. But let's take that offline and get with the aftermarket team and let them address that one.
Absolutely. And that was our last question, and we're exactly on time. So look at that. Thank you, Neil. Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Chris. Great job, you guys. And if you have questions or follow up, anything that you need, go ahead and email us at training@donaldson.com. We'd be happy to help. Hope you have a great
Thank
rest
you.
of